There is a sidewalk on the other side of the street to the station, but no crosswalk to get across to the station. And also the corner of Deakin and Leland, there is another dangerous intersection. I must tell you that subsequently to the policy committee, I've been speaking to VDOT, and at this Deakin Road and Leland cross, they are improving this intersection and will be looking at a crosswalk here for people to cross. So there is work being done in the area, but there are just some that I thought to point out. The question that came up at a previous committee meeting, people asked, well, if we have MARC trains coming through to Virginia or VRE trains going through to Baltimore in Maryland, how exactly is the technology going to work? So that piece of equipment there on the slide is the answer. It's currently, that particular one's currently being used by New Jersey Transit. It is a dual diesel and electric locomotive. So it can work in Virginia where there is no overhead electrical catenary wires, but it can also work in Maryland where there are overhead electrical catenary wires. And if VRE or MARC trains purchased a locomotive like this, you could run the trains through the two states. And I believe that a decision was voted through the Maryland state legislature a couple of weeks back, which approved the start of negotiations between MARC and VRE to begin this process. So that's a very exciting development. It will see more trains and more frequent trains in the future if this is done. Buses, some exciting changes coming at Fred Bus. There's going to be selective additional Saturday service and weekend service for various routes. With the approval of the board, they're looking at starting operations from 7 a.m. or 7:30 a.m. in the morning on many routes that only start at 8 a.m. currently. And this is going to give people the opportunity to get to work using the bus, because now you can actually get to work by 8 a.m. if you take the bus. And they've got this new Route Shout app too, which gives you real-time information about the location of buses, which is an interesting and very useful app for your phone. In terms of the decisions that were taken in the meeting, your chairman alluded to some of these just now. The Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program and the Surface Transportation Block Grant Prioritization Methodology was approved at the Policy Committee. There was a call for projects that has begun, so we are inviting our jurisdictions and those that qualify to apply for funding in the next round, and that has already begun. Since the Policy Committee meeting, the regional goals and objectives, which caused you such a headache at your last meeting, the Policy Committee finally decided to approve those goals and objectives. So they will be used now in the process of developing the long-range transportation plan. Resolution 2116 was approved, which is an administrative matter. It's about a tip rollover amendment. The annual review of the George Washington Regional Commission and FAMPO Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, was approved unchanged, which means our relationship with our fiscal agent, the George Washington Regional Commission, or GWRC, will remain in place and remain unchanged for the foreseeable future. The decision was taken to appoint a special executive committee meeting to receive and approve the UPWP update. This is a minor administrative matter to allow for some staffing changes, which needed an amendment to the UPWP, and that was the appointment of the executive to make this decision on behalf of FAMPO was approved because the public comment period would only expire after the last FAMPO Policy Committee meeting. So the executive was given permission by the Policy Committee to approve that amendment after the public comment period. No comments were received from the public, and the special executive met subsequent to the Policy Committee and approved that update decision. In terms of our staffing plan, I reported at the Policy Committee that we've done the biannual staff evaluations. They were successful and seemed to be well done. There were at that point no staffing changes, and we noted the move of Dr. Millsaps from our fiduciary agent to the new position she's taken up elsewhere, and we wish her well. Subsequent to the Policy Committee, policy committee meeting. However, there have been 2 changes, which, Chairman, if you give me the permission, I'll just report those now so that I don't have to come back and report again under the staff matters later on in your agenda. We've taken the decision to close the position of a full-time executive assistant to the administrator. We have only a staff of 6 that report to me, and to have a full-time executive assistant when we really need planners to do our work just seemed perhaps not the best use of our resources. So we've decided to close that full-time executive assistant position, and we have advertised, and you'll see the advertisement on our website, we've advertised for a full-time planner to join us, transportation planner with some experience, and we look forward to appointing a new candidate in due course. That's all that I wish to report at this stage, and I hope that gives you just an impression of the policy committee meeting and things that were decided and steps that were taken and so on. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the additional updates after the policy committee. Very helpful. We'll move to item number, well, excuse me, is there any discussion or questions for Ian about the policy committee meeting? Didn't mean to cut anybody off. All right, thank you. Now we'll move to the public comment period. Stacy has informed me that she has no comments or questions that need to be read to us that we've gotten before the meeting. So at this point, I will ask anyone in the public, anyone who's dialed in, listening in, if they have any comments they would like to make at this time. Is there anyone? Comments? All right, hearing none, seeing none, we will close the first public comment period. And later in the meeting, there will be a second opportunity for anyone who's dialed in to raise a comment or question. All right, moving to Kate is going to give us an update under 8A on the GW Ride Connect update, fundings and those issues.
All right, thank you. So my name is Kate Gibson. I am currently the interim executive director at the George Washington Regional Commission, which is the staffing and fiscal agent for FAMPO, but we also operate the GW Ride Connect program. So tonight I am going to give you a brief update on GW Ride Connect funding. This presentation was given to the TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee of FAMPO, earlier this month, and we will also be giving this presentation to the Policy Committee of FAMPO later this month. So just really quickly, what is GW Ride Connect? So we are a Transportation Demand Management, or TDM for short, program operated by the George Washington Regional Commission. We serve all 5 localities of Planning District 16, and we began providing services as Radco Rideshare in 1974 in response to the 1973 oil crisis. So we're coming up on our 50-year anniversary, which is pretty exciting. So just really quickly, what is TDM? And I totally stole these definitions from Wikipedia and stole this image from the city of Monterey, California, but I think this really well illustrates what TDM is. It's the application of strategies and policies to reduce travel demand or to redistribute the demand in space or time. So you can see in the image, basically through TDM measures, we're getting folks out of their car or single occupant vehicle into a lot of different modes or other solutions that help reduce travel demand. So walking, transit, biking, but also teleworking or working off site or flexing your hours so that you're working different hours and can avoid peak travel times. So TDM is really what kind of boils down to a cost-effective alternative to increasing capacity, aka building more lanes on the highway. And this is just an illustration of TDM in practice. So we're getting folks out of their cars, their single occupant vehicles. This traffic jam is really only 88 people. So if you get those people into carpools, vanpools, and commuter buses, the traffic jam goes away. And the goal of GW Ride Connect is to promote, plan, and establish transportation alternatives to the single occupant vehicle, so driving alone, improving air quality, reducing congestion, and improving quality of life. So the meat of the presentation that I gave to the Technical Advisory Committee and giving to FAMPO is around FAMPO's funding of GW Ride Connect. So by way of background, the CMAQ STBG, and that stands for Congestion, Mitigation, Air Quality, and Surface Transportation Block Grant. Those are two types of federal transportation funds. So I think there's probably more on the agenda about these later on this evening, but just know that those are two types of federal funds that are out there for transportation. So FAMPO has a CMAQ STBG prioritization methodology document. And a part of that document, well, the purpose of the document is to really outline how funding decisions are made for how CMAQ and STBG funding should be spent in the region. So part of the prioritization methodology includes this language that basically says each year, as long as there's funding available and as long as there is a need, FAMPO will give $125,000 to GW Ride Connect in order to support their basic operations as a TDM program. And so for many years, GW Ride Connect did receive this off-the-top allocation from FAMPO. We received between $125,000 to $225,000. That number kind of fluctuated over time in off-the-top allocations for several years. However, on June 15th, 2020, the FAMPO Policy Committee voted to reallocate GW Ride Connect's out-year funding. So FY22 through FY25, off the top CMAQ allocations, so 4 years worth of funding totaling $500,000. And at the time, the FAMPO TAC committed to helping GW Ride Connect identify and explore other funding sources that would help kind of replace that funding and help maintain GW Ride Connect's financial sustainability. That funding was moved from the GW Ride Connect project to other transportation projects in the region. So this is where we are as of now, and I'm comparing our projected funding for next fiscal year starting July 1 for FY22 to our FY20 budget. I'm not comparing it to FY21 because that budget is totally wonky due to COVID, but you can see the CMAQ funding from FAMPO, the off-the-top allocation is removed. We also currently get 2 grant applications or grants every year from the Department of Rail and Public Transportation, so DRPT, and you can see that the funding for those 2 grants kind of shifts between the 2 grants, but the total is remaining the same from FY20 to FY22. That 4th line down, DRPT Advantage. So we're actually applying for a new grant starting in FY22 to help fund our Advantage Vanpool Self-Insurance Program. That will be $75,000 if it's awarded. So that's new funding that wasn't available in FY20. And then we also get some CMAQ funding for leasing parking spaces throughout the region to help kind of supplement what's available at commuter lots. We're also working with Caroline County to fund some lease spaces in Ladysmith. And then we had a Van Start grant for I-395, the I-395 corridor that we had in FY20 and ended at the end of FY20. So overall, If we are to get the additional DRPT funding that we've requested, it's not guaranteed, but we're hopeful that we will receive it. Our change in funding from FY20 to FY22 will be a reduction of a little over $65,000. So just to kind of expand on that, like I said, we've submitted this grant application for the $75,000. If it's awarded, the reduction in our budget is only $65,000. If it's not awarded, then the hole is bigger, a little over $140,000, but we are hopeful that it will be awarded. We've made some budget adjustments for FY22. So we actually had already reduced the number of leased spaces that we had a lease agreement for, and so that cost has gone down because of that. So that's why there's a reduction in that line. We've also been able to reduce our staffing budget. We had been paying for some of the GWRC executive director's time that way. And then we also have had some changes to our fringe and indirect rates that have brought that down. So bottom line, we believe if we're able to secure the additional $75,000 that we've requested from DRPT, that the GW Connect budget will be whole for FY22. However, we do have a funding need that is currently unmet by our current funding. So we need funding for a GWI Connect strategic plan. This is required in order to continue receiving DRPT funding. So that's really important. We have to do this if we want to continue to get that DRPT funding, which now without the CMAQ funding from FAMPO pretty much makes up all of GWI Connect's budget. This is not an eligible expense under our current DRPT grants that we receive. It is eligible under another DRPT funding source, but that funding source has a 50% match requirement, which is not feasible at this time. So the original deadline for completion of the plan was going to be January 1st, 2022, but DRPT is adjusting that timeline due to COVID. So here is our proposal of how we get this plan funded, given our kind of current funding situation. So it's really two parts. One is to utilize most of our remaining FY21 CMAQ funding, so that's this current fiscal year's funding through June 30th, for the strategic planning effort, beginning in the spring of this year and then concluding in FY22. As of the end of January, we actually had 62% of our funding remaining. And then we anticipate there to be some additional savings due to the resignation of the GWRC executive director and kind of some staffing reorganization that has happened in the interim period. The second piece is to request FAMPO staff's assistance with part of the plan. So there's a large part of the strategic plan that requires some mapping and data analysis that we think would be really well suited for the FAMPO staff given their skill set. And so we're asking that FAMPO include that in the FY22 UPWP, which is basically FAMPO's work plan for FY22 and budget, under TDM planning. So again, Transportation Demand Management Planning, that's already a section of FAMPO's work plan every year. And so we're just asking that this be included in that section. And so you can see there the types of things that are required for the strategic plan that we think FAMPO would be very well suited to help us complete. And that is all. Are there any questions?
So, Ian, I think that the last bit of that kind of activity that FAMPO could do probably seems to be well aligned, and you probably, you may not want to officially want to say, but I think you're going to be able to support that.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Chair, we're very happy to support this program. I don't know whether your committee members know all the details, but this program of GWI Connect supports the largest van pool operation in Virginia. And so we're very keen to have that continue because it replaces the commuter bus systems which used to run and have collapsed. So this is a very necessary way to reduce the number of cars on the road, and our staff are very happy to make the maps and the data analysis necessary for this strategic plan.
Yes, thank you. Questions from any of the committee members? My observation observing the TAC was that they felt that you came forward with a challenge, but you had the solutions, and they didn't seem to have any problems with it. It seemed they could satisfy that this was going to be feasible. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I thought we had a good reception from TAC, and that was very promising. So yeah, I definitely think that folks are on board with this idea, and that ultimately it will help us accomplish all the things that we want to be able to do. So.
And I think these alternatives to getting in vehicles is very important. It's a big issue that's been important to CTAC for a long time, and so it was. I wanted to make sure this briefing was presented to us after I saw that it was presented at CTAC. So thank you for that. And thank you for taking on the mantle of the interim at the GWRC. That's good.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right. Next, we have the Lrtp update with Adam. And there's three sub-items to this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think just two sub-items. We're going to talk a little bit about the roadway prioritization methodology update, and then talk a little bit about the fiscal constraint revenues that we're expecting over the next planning horizon for this work effort. So I've got Matthew running the slide, so I'm just going to prompt him here for the next slide. Great. So four main things wanted to discuss tonight with the CTAC is kind of the process for this document. I want to talk a little bit about what the scoring evaluation measures are. So how we're going to take a candidate project and apply different measures to score that in an objective and clear way. We've also, over the last month, developed a proof of concept kind of in-house as far as testing it out with existing Lrtp projects and seeing how they score. And then with round 4 smart scale projects. So for those who don't know, I think we talked about this a little bit in January, right after the news broke, but VDOT has released a staff recommended funding scenario for round 4 of smart scale. So as a result, we can see exactly how projects scored all the way down to the fine print. And so what we wanted to do with this process with the FAMPO Lrtp is we wanted to see how closely the work effort we're undertaking aligns with smart scale. So that's pretty cool to see, that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then just some next steps. So this is part of a larger process with the 2050 Lrtp, and one of the efforts that when Ian jumped on board a few months ago, we certainly wanted to focus on because we believe it's a worthwhile endeavor. So next slide. So by way of background a little bit, just talking a little bit about sort of the process that we've been through. One thing that we did in kind of late FY20, so this is kind of last summer, is we were asked by the policy committee to update our CMAQ and STBG. So those are the two kind of near-term funding sources that Kate talked a little bit about, where we were asked to update that methodology. And as we did some research and talked to our counterparts at other NPOs, what we were basically told is, look, you really want to start with your Lrtp process before you make a substantial overhaul to your kind of near-term over the next kind of 5 and 6 years funding buckets. So with that, we said, okay, we're doing the 2050 update to the Lrtp. So let's see if we can focus on updating the methodology for that document in a long-term sense. And again, that's what Ian has been driving forward since he's jumped on board here recently. So I'll point out too that this is one of the work efforts that's listed in our FY21 Unified Planning Work Program for the UPWP. And then I think I mentioned a second ago that other NPOs across the state are undertaking similar updates. Again, this is part of where the byproduct of having been through 3 full rounds of smart scale, NPOs are starting to take a look at how well the projects that they prioritize for their Lrtps, when you apply for funding in smart scale, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. How well is it doing? And so this is our effort to respond to those types of things that are going on. Next slide. So the first step again here is to update the roadway prioritization methodology. So FAMPO does have an existing methodology document. We call it highway. We switched the terminology to roadway. We thought that was a little more sort of digestible by most audiences. And what we're going to do is focus there first, and then switch gears and look at other project types. So we have a transit and TDM. So TDM is what Kate talked about a few minutes ago, transportation demand management. And we also want to have our own methodology for bike ped projects and then studies as well. So the intention here is that once all 4 have been approved, our staff is going to reissue the call for projects for the 2050 Lrtp. So that's something that has been put on hold for quite some time now. We were about to ramp up and reissue that process back in January. And we said, let's really focus our attention here and do a good job, a good comprehensive effort with the scoring methodologies, and then revisit the call for projects. And then again, the updated methodologies can be utilized and modified over time to score projects for the near-term funding buckets with the CMAQ and the STBG. So that's what Hampton Roads has done over the last kind of 4 or 5 years. And it's what other NPOs across the state are doing as well. So next slide, Matthew. So just briefly, the draft scoring evaluation measures, there's kind of 3 primary categories that we've looked at as a staff, where we wanted to sort of have multiple lenses through which we could score and evaluate projects. So first is 60% of a project score. We wanted the project to align with SMART scale. So again, it's not the only funding source that projects can receive funding for, but it's one of the primary and kind of most one-to-one with how the NPO process works for funding projects. So that's, again, 60% of a project score right now. And then the weighting sort of thereunder with safety, congestion mitigation, that follows typology B. So there's A, B, C, and D. And for those that have been around for some time now, know that FAMPO used to be in category A, where congestion mitigation was rated at, like, I want to say 30%. And now we've switched gears down to category B, so it's only, say, 15%. So the breakdown between 12% and 9% follows that. We also have a statewide coordination measure, so we want to ensure that what we're doing at the regional level here aligns with what the state is doing. Again, they're the ones that sort of set the rules and dictate how the funding is allocated, so we want to make sure that we're in alignment with those processes. And we have 30% for project benefit, and what that means for our purposes is a little bit more of a qualitative approach, where we look at how well does it align with what we're doing as a region. So what we're doing here with the FAMPO area is not exactly what they're doing in Roanoke or in Charlottesville. So we wanted to look at some of the things that are important to us, to the policy committee, to the CTAC, and then to the TAC as well, and build that into the scoring process. So next slide.
This is Rupert. How do you measure that?
Well, we will get into that here, Rupert, on, I believe, slide 7 or 8. So we can get into the weeds here in just a moment, if that's okay.
Sure.
So just briefly, this is a lot of information, a lot of text. So feel free to stop me, but I'll just sort of cover briefly what each of these measures tries to do. So again, with the first 6 measures, so safety, congestion mitigation, those types of things, it's as close to the SMART scale scoring process as we could do, but in a simplified way that our team of 6 has the capability of doing. So the folks at SMART scale that sort of drew up how they do this at the statewide level have dozens and dozens of people on a team, lots of IT capabilities that we just don't have. So we wanted to say, how closely can we mimic that process, but do it in a simple and clear way? So with safety, we've got things like PSI locations. So that's a potential for safety improvement. And we have things like a ranking that the state has provided over the last few years, where they say, here's where the most dangerous intersection is in the state, if you will. So if we have a project that comes in and it is at the 5th most dangerous one, that's going to receive higher points than a project for safety than one that's not at a PSI location. So again, that's just one example here of sort of one of the line items with the scoring measures. Get down to congestion mitigation, current VC ratio, so that's a volume to capacity. So if there's a roadway that's intended to provide a decent level of service for, say, 10,000 vehicles a day, but we see that there's 15,000 vehicles per day, that volume to capacity ratio is going to be pretty high. And then same thing with level of service. So that's where you get sort of a letter grade, and this is a traffic engineering type thing as far as how they calculate it. But we said, you know, if there's an LOS that is a grade F, there's probably more of a need for improvement at that location than one that has an A, for example. So next slide, Matthew.
Adam, can I editorialize at this point, please?
You may.
Thank you. So as we look at this and the PSI and VC, we represent the citizenry. We represent people who are not steeped in the language and the acronyms. I mean, if PSI and that block had just even been spelled out what PSI is. I even went to the FAMPO book that we put out to help citizenry know about what they need to know about transportation, looked in the glossary and the acronym section, and even those acronyms are not in there, VC. And so, I mean, it would be an easy thing to have a mindset of people who might be looking at this probably need a little more than PSI, but if it was even spelled out would be helpful. So,
no, that's a fair point, and that's definitely something that I think we can add. This was essentially adapted from kind of the working spreadsheet that we have as a staff. So no, that's a very fair point, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that.
We have people to give inputs to it, and it's difficult. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I'll say too, if there's any other acronyms that we come across that I don't explain here verbally as I go through the presentation, please let me know. But I think I covered the ones there on that first slide. As far as accessibility, so we wanted to look at the multimodal sort of components that does the project, including more than one node. What types of choices does it offer a user? So if it's something that you can connect a roadway project to a transit facility, that's going to receive higher points than one that's just a roadway, for example. And then also disadvantaged populations. So we wanted to look at the areas in our region that have disproportionately high populations of those that have been affected in the past as far as not receiving funding or having a highway built right through their neighborhood, that type of thing. We're looking to measure that as well. And then with environmental quality, we look at where a project is located and its impact to natural and cultural resources. With economic development, there's a few different things that we look at. One is, so VEDP, here's another acronym, Mr. Chair, that we didn't spell out. So this is the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. So they have a statewide database of sites that are sort of ready-made for companies to move in that want to have a new plant or a new warehouse, that type of thing. And then local land use, so we look at the types of zoning that's around the project location. So if you're looking to provide better access to a commercial zoning area that has lots of jobs, that's going to provide a better benefit than one that is serving very few people. And then also we look at freight. So if the project is on the freight network, and then that little acronym there in the measure description column, P4P, that is the Pathways for Planning data set. That is a VDOT sort of web-based tool where we get a lot of our data for transportation planning. Next slide. Again, here with land use, we look at the current and projected number of jobs and population that's within 1 mile of the project location. Statewide coordination, again, so the state has developed a statewide transportation plan. So this is sort of the state's version of what we're doing with the FAMPO LRTP called VTrans. And they have listed out a set of needs. And then what they've done more recently is they have prioritized those needs, some of which are at the district level, so all of the Fredericksburg district, some of them at the state level. So we basically have sort of a checkbox exercise here to see, does it align with the need, which is a smart scale requirement if you want to receive funding through that program. And then again, sort of the magnitude as well. So if it's a need that's listed at tier 1, that's going to receive higher marks than a need that's at tier 4. Next slide.
Hey, while we're on that slide about land use, the population projections, are they taking into account the population induced by the project?
Rupert, that's a very good question. They do not take into account projected induced population. Part of what we wanted to do with this update to this process for FAMPO is not require travel demand modeling as part of the scoring process. So In fact, we actually learned today from the state that a lot of MPOs are kind of moving away from requiring a modeling effort. So it's a very complex process, requires a lot of time. And so we wanted to look at more so location-based elements. So again, the data used to project out population, we have that data set, but it's independent from each potential proposed improvement that we would be evaluating through this process.
Too bad. Thanks.
So lastly, with project benefits, so again, this is where it gets a little bit more qualitative. And I think one thing that we've learned through a lot of the research that we've done is that if you have something that is 100% objective and you're just using data sets, it doesn't always tell the whole story. And so what we wanted to look at is things like whether the project is recommended in a planning study. So again, that's something that is required for smart scale. The improvement impact. So this is where, what we've rolled out here is we've said, based on what the project is trying to do, our sort of staff level assessment about whether the project will be able to carry that out. So again, it's not a technical type thing that we'd be looking at there, but more so qualitative. And then with the project benefit 3, so regional benefit, we have a list of 4 questions that are important to the region. And so again, just provide it out of 10, what our staff recommended sort of justification would be there. And then lastly, does it meet goals? So this is where, again, last month we presented the goals and objectives for the LRTP. So we wanted to look at how closely that project aligns with those goals and objectives. Next slide.
While you're on that slide, you might want to make note of the fact that the word provides is duplicated and at the beginning of the paragraph in PB3.
Good call. Thank you, Rupert. So as far as a proof of concept, so with existing projects, this is how some of them scored. So this is all out of 10, and then I'll go through a couple notes on the next page here. But basically what you see with the acronyms there across the different columns is safety, congestion mitigation, and that little W just means that it's weighted according to the weights that I showed a few slides before. So you'll see that when we get closer to the actual score, the PB weighted, that's the project benefit. Since those are more so qualitative in nature, we just provided a neutral score for providing a test case. So Matthew, if you can go to the next slide here.
And Adam, so that S was safety, C was congestion. It ties right back into like your first slide with the different things that would be recommended and were included in the previous slide. So it ties back in, even though it's not totally clear, but that's what it is.
That's right. So a few notes on the proof of concept for existing projects. So this was a random sampling of existing 2045 LRTP projects against different categories. I think I mentioned that we used a neutral project benefit score for testing. One thing that I'll point out is that the methodology tends to benefit projects on larger roadways. And I think in some ways, you could make a case for the fact that for a project to be truly beneficial to a region, it's going to tend to be a larger project. So if you're looking at small improvements here and there, they might be important to a certain neighborhood, to a certain corridor, which is not to say that they aren't important at a regional level. Oftentimes they are, but that's one thing that we noticed here is that it tends to favor projects on some larger roadways. And then since we have done this sort of proof of concept for existing projects, we've rolled out a few updates, a few tweaks. We've noticed that the distribution of the data for certain metrics doesn't exactly fit. So we've made a few updates, and then I'll talk a little bit on the last slide, I believe, about a workshop that we're going to have next week that is open to the public. So next slide, Matthew. Again, here with the proof of concept for Smart Scale, what we wanted to look at is for the projects that scored well in Smart Scale. And I'll just say kind of simply that if you look at the column total SSPB without cost, so that's Smart Scale, project benefit without cost, that's the ranking of all of the roadway Smart Scale projects in the FEMCO area from round 4. So the ones that are highlighted in that sort of peach color on the left, those are the ones that are slated for funding. And then what you'll see in the column that has the green highlights is what those projects scored as with our LRTP process. So the darker the green, the higher the number, the better they scored in our process. So what you see here generally just on this table is a pretty decent correlation between how well a project did in Smart Scale that has all the fancy tools and the dozens of team members that are going through the process of scoring projects, and then our simplified approach here in the green, we think is a pretty close alignment. So you can see over on the right-hand side of this table that the difference at most across these roughly, I guess it's about 15 projects, is 4, right? So if there's a project that was 10th on the Smart Scale list, it wouldn't be any more than 6 or 14 on our list. So if you go to the next slide, Matthew, there's a few notes I wanted to make about the proof of concept for Smart Scale. The first is that there are 2 FAMPO area projects that we did not include in this list that are bike ped projects. Again, this is this scoring process is specific to roadways. The intention of this methodology is to not account for costs. So this is sort of a major thing that we've been talking about internally with our team, because Smart Scale, where the kind of rubber meets the road there, if you will, is they take the total project benefit and divide that by the project cost. So you could have the most beneficial project in the world. It checks all the boxes, but if it costs $100 million, odds are it's not going to get funding through Smart Scale. So it's all dependent on what the financial ask is through that funding program. So what we've said with the LRTP is kind of one, the nature of every project is not always going to be best suited to receive funding through Smart Scale, right? So there are some projects, especially projects on 95, although there's fewer now because of all the improvements taking place, but there are some projects on 95 that would probably not be projects that we'd submit in Smart Scale. So we wanted to be, at this point, agnostic to cost with the LRTP process. Again, we think that there's a relatively strong correlation between the project's LRTP ranking and then how it did in Smart Scale. And again, all of that is relative to the universe of FAMPO projects. So that's not looking at other projects in different parts of the state. And then just a note on the numbers in the table, the LRTP scoring is out of 10. Smart Scale is scored relative to the highest ranking project for each measure. So it's a little bit complicated. We don't need to get in the weeds there, I don't think, but just keep in mind that the output values that are in the green and the blue columns are not exactly one-to-one. So I think here on the last slide, Matthew, as far as next steps, we talked about the workshop that we're going to be hosting on the 19th at 9:30 a.m. So that information will be available on our website. So we've asked our TAC members, for any who are interested in sort of getting into the fine print, if you will, to join us at that point. I think that'll go about an hour and a half next Friday. If any CTAC members want to provide any comments to us, we're happy to take a call, or if you want to send an email, we're more than happy to sort of factor that in. So I would ask if you do have any, please do send that to us before the 19th so that we can include that in everything that we go through in that meeting. We are going to be asking for committee approval in April. So we've presented kind of a brief update in February, a more detailed update here in March, and we'll be asking for approval after the workshop. And like I mentioned earlier, as far as the process, we are continuing to work on the methodologies for transit TDM, bike ped or active transportation, and then planning studies. So I know that's quite a bit. There might be some questions, so I'm happy to take those at this point.
Yeah, well, this is Rupert. To me, the big flaw is the transit is being analyzed separately from roads, whereas they both might be competing for the same funding to accomplish the same goal.
No, that's a good point, and that's one thing, Rupert, that we have discussed. The way that we outline funding in the LRTP, it actually is a little bit more discrete than that. Now, by the time projects do apply for funding, especially via Smart Scale, you're right, it's sort of the same pot there, if you will, between transit and roadway improvements. But in the LRTP, we look at the expected revenues for transit-specific funding programs and then roadway-specific funding programs. And so that's why historically, and still now, FAMPO has 3 different project lists for the LRTP. So it's not all sort of one big pot of funding. We've got our funding for the roadway bike ped, we have our transit and TDM project list, and then we have the studies project list. So we wanted to have methodologies that replicated that distinction. But to your point, you're right in the sense of by the time a project would apply for funding for Smart Scale, it's sort of all one pot that VDOT has the responsibility to allocate.
Thanks. Yeah, that's been a sore subject ever since day one, the way the funding is allocated like that. If it were a fair world, all the transportation money would be eligible for all the projects, and then each project could succeed or fail on its own merit.
I would support that. I think that that's a very fair point and something that would make our lives a little bit easier as transportation planners.
That'd be even better. Thanks.
As Rupert mentioned, I mean, the methodology has been a discussion at CTAC for well before I was involved, but coming on, so I know there's, I think a Larry or a Neil has probably got some questions, or if they don't have questions, might have some inputs that hopefully they can get to the group before the 19th of March.
No, I'm listening. I don't have any questions right now. I'm sort of wondering how you would get from, if you do a pure prioritization that doesn't count money, then how do you get from there to figuring out how you would submit it for Smart Scale or have some idea how it's going to fare in Smart Scale?
Larry, I'm going to mute your line here. There's a little bit of feedback. Okay, there we go. So I think if I heard the question correctly there, what we're talking about is the funding as far as, how we prioritize projects without cost and how that would impact by the time a project gets to a Smart Scale application. So you can correct me if I don't understand that exactly right, Larry, but I think basically, that's one of the big question marks that we had when we started this process is, do we want to factor the cost in? Because some projects are entirely conceptual by the time they come to us to score for the LRTP. If we get an application from Stafford County, they say, hey, this is on our radar. We're hoping to do this by the year 2040. Any cost estimate they have at that point is also going to be conceptual. It's just going to be a planning level cost estimate. And by the time we get to Smart Scale round 15, right, the nature of that project, the details of that project are likely going to have changed in some way, shape, or fashion before it gets to the Smart Scale process. So I think in a short-term capacity, the funding is extremely important. So especially leveraged funding. So if that same project, say in Stafford County, I'm just taking a hypothetical project here, had $10 million of revenue sharing funding, $3 million of STVG, and $2 million of CMAQ, and all you had to ask Smart Scale for was $7 million, despite it being a $22 million project, which, for Smart Scale purposes, projects that are that expensive typically do not get funded unless they have a very high project benefit measure. That's just one of the things that we're going to have to come down one way or the other with our LRTP process, that it's not going to be exactly perfect translating from what we do at the regional level to Smart Scale, but we're trying to replicate it the closest we can in the most appropriate, responsible way, which at this point we're proposing to not factor in cost.
I got it. Do I still have feedback here?
No, you're a lot clearer now.
Any other questions? I think it's making some real progress. Ian's probably smiling, saying we're getting a better process for methodology of valuation, and it's just going to continue to get better as we look at the other items that need prioritization as well. We try to bring them all into kind of one alignment. So that's good. Great briefing, Adam. Thank you.
And we can switch gears here, Mr. Chair, to the next item that I believe your request we put on the agenda. So we don't have anything too big here to update the committee on, but did want to provide this again at the chair's request as far as the projected revenues from VDOT for our 2050 long-range transportation plan update. So we were asked at the CAC meeting in February to provide this in March, just to look at essentially the impact of COVID on budgets. So that was the intention here. And one thing that I'll point out is for the sort of near-term period, so basically right now, FY21 all the way to FY26, there's some years that actually go up in funding based on what we were expecting a few years ago, and then some years like FY21 where funding is down quite a bit. So over the course of the entire planning horizon, funding is actually much higher than what the projected funding was in 2018 for that same time period. So that's good news. Again, a lot of this is there's nothing that is set in stone right now except for these next 6 years, basically from FY21 to 26. So as most of you know, the state sort of goes through a process to update the 6-year improvement program every year. And so it sort of tackles that next out year of that 6-year sort of funding program. So the actual funding that FAMPO receives in 2030 or in 2045, it's a guess. It's just an estimate based on how things have gone over the last few years, as well as sort of current realities that we know today. But happy to take any of your questions, Mr. Chair, after you requested this on the agenda.
Well, could you explain, so the bottom 3 lines, so the 2021 CLRP is what's going to essentially affect the 2050 LRTP, right?
That's right. So that line,
and the 28 was what was in the 2045, and so it's the delta between those projections.
That's exactly right.
Now, some of the things, the ups and downs, I mean, like, do you have any feel, in the out years, I agree, it's not even really worth spending much attention, but in that first slide, I mean, state of good repair is going to be zeroed, out there. I mean, do you have any sense for why some of these large ups and downs are occurring?
State of good repair, so that is, in layman's terms, maintenance, but it's only a certain subset of project types. So there's also like another maintenance line item there that you see, but state of good repair is certain projects that have to be in the TIP, right? So the Transportation Improvement Program. I can't speak, Mr. Chair, to why they would be zeroed out for certain years. My guess is that they would be covered via other buckets, sort of, the other line items here. So if there's a project that is programmed in the TIP right now, which goes all the way out to FY24, that funding is there. They're going to make it happen one way or another. So at a minimum, what that could mean is that it would just push that project that might start in FY24 out to the next year or out to FY26. So they're going to happen. It's just a matter of when. But a lot of times, VDOT has the ability at the state level to move the funding from one bucket to another. So if expenses are down in one bucket and up in another, you can sort of reappropriate and get the projects done at that level.
It may be worthwhile to focus on this slide for some of those variances when you go to the PC that may ask those kind of questions, and some of them, and get VDOT to say, what's the rationale for this one? So, but
Sure.
I wouldn't spend any time on the out year briefing, as we all know. So cool. All right. Thank you. Thanks for putting it on the briefing and presenting it.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. All right. Stacy is on. Upcoming public comment.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hopefully you can now.
You're loud
Okay,
and-
great.
Stacy, we can't hear you now.
Oh no.
Stacy, your microphone is gone. We can't hear you.
Okay. Adam, can you, I mean, it's addressed to you. Can you cover this in the interim?
I would be happy to do so, Mr. Chair. I'll see if Stacy can get reconnected and take back over. I think the reasons I'm actually pulling up the agenda here on my other screen, so give me just a second. But I think that the intention of sort of having this on the agenda for tonight was to notify the CTAC that there would be here soon a forthcoming public comment period on an amendment to the existing, to the 2045 long-range transportation plan project lists. So Smart Scale Round 4, the results have just come out. And one of the things that we've been asked to do by VDOT is amend the project list where the projects that we applied for across the regions, and not just FAMPO, but the localities as well. If a project that was applied for is not in an existing project list, or it's a little bit different from what's listed, this is basically a way to reconcile the two. And so VDOT hasn't said at this point exactly how time sensitive this is, but our understanding is that we need to have this done this fiscal year so that when the CTV actually signs on the dotted line for all of the funding for Smart Scale Round 4, there's no paperwork exercises that have to be done after the fact. We've done it now. So what we're doing right now is working with VDOT still, working with our locality partners to get down into the weeds, figure out exactly how certain projects need to be updated on their listing in the LRTP. And in April, we are going to have the amendment ready to go, and we're going to be seeking approval from the committees to advance this to the policy committee to then have them direct us to do a public comment period. So we thought there would be a chance we could go ahead and start the public comment period this month. A few details to iron out, so we'll in all likelihood be coming back next month where this is all going to be spelled out in the project list. So what we've done here too, if Matthew can scroll down to slide 5, I'm definitely not going to go line by line here, but this is basically a quick summary of kind of the projects that are affected by Smart Scale that are highlighted in green, and then there's a few projects that are highlighted in purple that we're looking to just sort of update from an administrative point of view. So if the funding has been closed out, the project is done, we're just saying, hey, we're going to go ahead and take this off because it's done. So again, Matthew, if you'll scroll to the right side of the page, all the way to the very top on slide 5, you'll sort of see the breakdown with the columns. So you'll see FAMPO staff comment, just sort of, again, our sort of commentary on what's happening, and then the Smart Scale project description for all the projects that are relevant to Smart Scale Round 4. So in short, just to summarize, we'll come back next month with the amendment ready to go, and we'll be asking for the CTAC to sort of push this along to the policy committee for them to go ahead and have us do a public comment period. And Stacy, do we have you? Yeah, we can hear you.
Yep. Adam or Stacy, so with the responses we got from Steve Hain, I mean, he's a great partner at VDOT with everything. I think it was especially surprising in his responses or troublesome to you, or does it kind of all make sense? Pretty happy with this.
I'll let Ian say if he disagrees, but no, I think this is pretty straightforward. There's not necessarily a handbook or a manual for this time every 2 years where Smart Scale comes out, LRTP says what it says, just trying to reconcile it too. So no, we were very happy with his responses, thought they were very thorough. So again, there's a few small details that we have to work out, but nothing surprising, nothing controversial by any means.
Good. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me from Steve and the others at VDOT. They're good partners. So, thank you. Okay, now we're at equity analysis. Jordan.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to explain that the equity analysis is looking at traditionally underserved populations. So that includes groups like minority, low income, cars with or households with no cars, limited English proficiency populations, and a few more. And this is to ensure that there is no disproportionate burdens to these populations through our planned transportation projects. And so on the next slide, we see a few of the completed steps that we've already done so far. So we've collected data from the 2018 American Community Survey with the 5-year estimates. And so when we originally presented this back last fall, we were looking at the census tract level. However, we have updated information at a smaller scale at the census block group level. And that was at the recommendation of our LRTP consultants. And the next thing that we have completed is mapping all the TIP projects. So we transitioned from the 2018-21 TIP to the new 21-24 TIP, and the TIP is the Transportation Improvement Program. And so some of the projects were outdated and some of the projects were new for this next 4 fiscal years. And overall, some of the projects are not included in our analysis. So things like miscellaneous projects, that's fundings for things like studies, long-range planning, and the public involvement funding. Those aren't specifically tied to a certain geographic area, so those won't be included in our analysis. Certain statewide and district-wide projects, since they're typically requested by the state, they're not put in by our local region. They're just going to be automatically included and not be analyzed. Grouped projects, and these projects are typically grouped together in funding categories because they're not regionally significant. So these projects will be included. And then UPCs, which is the Unified Planning Code that VDOT uses to identify the project. Some of them don't have a terminus, aka like a starting location or ending location. And most of those projects are just for wrapping up the debt, whereas the construction has been completed and they're just still paying further payments to wrap up that project. So we created an outline for this document, and the sections listed on this slide have already been completed. And a few more have been completed since we presented this at the TAC. We reviewed best practices at the state to determine what would be the best measure for measuring benefits and burdens. We previously had reviewed best practices for how to determine the location and the density of the populations that we're looking at. So on the next slide, we talk about what are the next steps that we're going to do. So like I just mentioned, we are looking at the best practices to measure the benefits and burdens. And right now I'm wrapping up that analysis and putting that into the document to say the general benefits and burdens that these projects will have on our region. And then we are going to write the results and summaries of this so that we can present that back and have information to inform us when we're making these transportation projects. And then we're going to create some graphics and some maps and some charts to represent this data in a visual format. And so on the last slide, we talk about the schedule. So we're wrapping up this document in the next week or so, and then we're going to finalize the document and seek approval as we go into the month of April. And so this will be also linked to the Lrtp 2050 update, whereas we want to ensure that analysis covers both projects that are in the Transportation Improvement Program, or the TIP, as well as the Long-Range Transportation Plan, because the TIP is just a subset of the list on the Long-Range Transportation Plan. So I can take any questions on the process, document, or the steps that we've been taking so far.
Jordan, this is for people who are newer on the committee. This has been going on for a while. So I think it's, if you could repeat again the purpose of equity analysis and the kind of communities that we're trying to address, since we represent the community trying to interact with the transportation planning. So I think that'd be helpful to those people that who might not have been exposed to this issue or this effort previously.
Yeah, of course. So the main purpose of this equity analysis is to comply with federal non-discrimination laws. So acts like the Title VI plan of the which includes minority and low income, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Age Discrimination Act, all those types of acts that are either executive orders or from Congress. We're trying to include those in this analysis so that we ensure that we comply with those federal non-discrimination laws, and that we are able to see how these planned projects will impact these communities, whether it's going to benefit them. Maybe a project will provide access to a high commercial density area, so that can be for commerce, that could be for economic employment opportunities, things like that. Whereas a project might be widening a roadway, and that might take away a few parcels of land, and maybe those parcels belong to someone who is in those underserved communities, and that may be viewed as a burden. And so there's no real defining line of what is a benefit and burden, and a lot of this is left up to interpretation of the planners. So Adam, Stacy, and I have been working on how we're measuring it and what is a fair measure for these different projects that are included.
Jordan, will this document be available as a, I'm sorry. Will this document be available as a freestanding document or just included in other documents?
So this is directly linked to the Transportation Improvement Plan, and it at the moment will be going into the appendices of that document, but there will also be an iteration for, like I said, the long-range transportation plan in early 2022 once we have those projects secured, and then we'll do the same analysis for those projects.
If I can just comment, Mr. Chair, it's quite easy for us to make the separate chapters of the LRTP available independently to people who are interested. We can also make the appendices available independently for people who want to read them. They'll be downloadable from the website as well eventually when they're approved. So we can make any one of these documents available as a standalone, just with a preface that it's meant to be part of a bigger document.
I was just curious if there's any thought that it might be of interest to citizens, residents out there in our service area.
We can happily make them available as chapters or as appendices individually if people are interested.
Thank you.
Yes, good discussion, good presentation. Any other questions? Thanks, Jordan. All right, time for public comment. So there might be members of the public who are dialed in, listening in, who, as a result of discussions we have just had, might have a question or a comment. And this is an opportunity for the public to make their input again. So is there anyone out there who would like to make an input? Anyone else? Anyone? Okay. Hearing none, seeing none, we'll close the second public comment for our meeting. And move to correspondence. I haven't missed anything, have I, Stacey? Make sure I'm on track. I think correspondence section. Yep. Yes. And kind of, we correspondence from Anton that who, because of duties at work and such, he has resigned from the committee. So Anton he got a gold star for attendance for one thing, and then he always had good inputs when we were discussing issues. So we're gonna miss Anton. Okay. All right, now we've got any member reports. Let's start with Stafford.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Dave Swan. I've been on 6:20. Sorry, I had a function this afternoon and I got delayed. But I have nothing to report from Stafford at the present time. There should be somebody else on, I hope.
Anyone else?
Elaine, I have no report either.
Who was that?
Elaine.
Elaine.
Oh, I'm Elaine. Okay, sure, gotcha.
Anyone else? Spotted.
Hey, Dave, this is Neil Holleran. I don't have anything significant to report, but welcome to Tara. And I did want to say, I got your comment earlier about the analysis and stuff going on. And yeah, I'm 2 years into this gig and I'm still trying to figure out how some of the analysis is done. And part of my gig at work is analysis. So I'm paying attention. It's just, a little bit to keep up with, but I'll definitely weigh in if I, see any errors or really have a good one. I might just steal it from the FAMPO guys. But other than that, yeah, I'm paying attention. That's all I got. Over.
Okay.
This is Al. I don't have
Anyone else? Okay, any of the Fredericksburg members?
This is Josh Brock. I have nothing in particular to report at this time.
Okay, King George. Right. Caroline. At large.
Hey, this is Larry. I just want to compliment Adam and his crew for doing the prioritization work. It sounds pretty good.
I'll second that.
You're
Move
right.
to be adjourned.
Can I have a second? You guys should be jumping on second to that.
Second.
Anybody opposed to adjourning the meeting? Thank you for a good, very, very good meeting. A lot of great information and good comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All in favor?
Aye.
Being adjourned.
This conference is no longer being recorded.